Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a different kind of rest. Not the sleeplessness of Lincoln's melancholy nights, not Kennedy's pharmaceutical wakefulness. Tonight we enter the world of the afternoon nap, of the president who slept not from illness but from exhaustion, not from insomnia but from the opposite, from the body's insistent demand for rest that could not be denied, from consciousness that required refuge that only sleep could provide. We're going to spend time with William Howard Taft. With the large, gentle man who wanted to be judge but became president, who carried weight both literal and metaphorical, who found his only peace in afternoon hours when consciousness would release him temporarily from burdens that waking made unbearable. This is not the Taft of cruel jokes and bathtub myths, not the caricature that history preserved, not the punchline that reduced complex human to single physical characteristic. This is the suffering man. The one who accepted a role he knew he was unsuited for because he could not disappoint those he loved, who endured 4 years of misery as president before finding genuine happiness as Chief Justice, who slept in afternoons not from laziness, but from the exhaustion of being something other than himself, who carried a body that society mocked and an office he never wanted, who maintained gentleness despite pressures that might have hardened anyone else. So before you settle in, if you'd like, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. There's something meaningful about exploring these afternoon hours together, finding connection in the shared human need for rest. Now let the afternoon light settle around you. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow one last time. Let the warmth of day's end wrap you gently, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Into the White House where a president sought shade, into the judicial chambers where a judge finally found peace, into the afternoon hours when consciousness could rest, into the gentle story of a man who knew that rest is not weakness but necessity, into Taft's world of afternoon refuge. Pause. The story we're about to explore is about many things, about the violence of being placed in wrong role, about the cost of accepting others' dreams while ignoring your own knowing, about how body size becomes story while character is forgotten, about friendship that became betrayal, about finding your calling after years of detour, about gentleness surviving despite everything that tries to break it, but mostly it's about rest, about the wisdom of knowing your limits, about the courage to honor your body's needs even when society judges those needs as weakness, about afternoon naps as survival strategy, as self-care, as recognition that some people require more rest than others and that this is not failing but simple reality. Taft came to the presidency in 1909. Succeeded Theodore Roosevelt, force of nature, larger-than-life predecessor who is impossible to follow. Taft never wanted the role, wanted to be judge, wanted quiet life of careful thought and written opinions. But his wife Nellie wanted the presidency. Roosevelt wanted Taft to succeed him. And Taft, gentle Taft, could not say no to people he loved, so he accepted, and spent 4 miserable years being wrong person in wrong place, being judged, being mocked, being exhausted by role that demanded qualities he did not possess and did not want to develop. We will explore 10 aspects of Taft's experience, 10 chapters in the story of the president who slept. We'll begin with the president who sought the shade, the afternoon retreats that made presidency bearable. We'll examine the weight that could not be lightened, the body that defined how he was perceived. We'll understand the office he never wanted, the tragedy of accepting unsuitable role. We'll enter the sanctuary of the afternoon, the sacred daily nap. We'll confront the bathtub that became legend, the cruel myths that persist. We'll witness the friendship that became betrayal, Roosevelt's transformation from mentor to enemy. We'll discover the judge who was always a judge, how judicial temperament made him wrong for presidency, but perfect for Supreme Court. We'll feel the cruelty of the body that public mocked, the constant judgment he endured. We'll celebrate the Supreme Court years, where sleep became peace when he finally found his place. We'll honor the gentleness that politics could not break, his persistent kindness, and we'll rest in the silence that holds the rest, the truth beneath the myths. This is not a political story, though politics are present. This is not about policy or judicial decisions, though these appear. This is a story about human vulnerability, about being seen only for your body while your mind and character are ignored, about the exhaustion of performing a role you're unsuited for, about the peace that comes from finally being in right place, about the wisdom of rest, about the courage to be gentle in a world that values hardness. About all the ways that Taft's story speaks to anyone who has felt misplaced, misjudged, or exhausted by expectations they cannot meet. Tonight we will move slowly through Taft's world. We'll not rush. We'll allow the afternoon light to warm us naturally. We'll permit rest to come as it comes. We'll explore what it means to need more rest than others consider normal, to carry body that does not conform, to maintain kindness despite cruelty, to find peace after years of struggle. These are not just Taft's experiences. These are human experiences that his particular circumstances illuminate for us. So let us begin. Let us enter the White House where afternoon light streams through windows. Let us sit in the study where a large man's eyes grow heavy despite work that waits. Let us understand that rest is wisdom, not weakness. Let us honor the afternoon nap. Let us explore the gentle president who slept. The journey begins. The afternoon deepens. And somewhere in a house built for governance, a man who needs rest allows himself to rest. The performance pauses, the burden lifts briefly, and consciousness finds the refuge it desperately needs. Afternoon sounds continue softly, the distant ticking of a clock now. Let us begin. Let us enter the hours when shade offered sanctuary. In a time when presidents were expected to embody endless vigor, when leadership was measured by visible energy, when rest was equated with weakness, when the American ideal was the tireless worker who needed neither sleep nor respite, in this time there was a man who understood something different, who knew that the body has its own wisdom, its own requirements, its own limits that cannot be exceeded without cost. William Howard Taft knew this not from theory but from lived experience. From inhabiting a body that made its needs undeniably clear, from carrying weight that made movement effortful and rest necessary, from suffering exhaustion that could not be ignored or pushed through or overcome by will alone, Taft knew that rest is not optional, is not luxury, is necessity. And in the afternoon hours, when the day's demands grew briefly less urgent, when the schedule allowed small gaps, when consciousness had carried its burden through morning and could carry no more, Taft would seek the shade, would find the quiet places, would surrender to sleep that came not gently but like falling into mercy. The White House during Taft's presidency was a place of constant activity, of meetings and ceremonies and the endless machinery of governance, of people coming and going, of decisions requiring attention, of crises demanding response, of the performance that presidency required: the public face, the confident demeanor, the appearance of tireless capability. Taft maintained this performance through morning hours, through the work that could not be avoided, through the obligations that his position demanded. But by afternoon, the performance cost more than he had left to give. The exhaustion accumulated, the body's demands grew insistent, the mind's clarity dimmed under the weight of continued effort. And Taft, who was if nothing else honest about his limitations, would acknowledge what could no longer be denied. He needed rest, needed it desperately. Needed it in ways that admitted no alternative. It is said that the afternoon naps began early in his presidency, were not something that developed over time but were immediate necessity. The stress of the office, the burden of following Roosevelt, the constant awareness of being judged and found wanting, the physical exhaustion of carrying his considerable weight through days that made no accommodation for his body's needs. All of this created deficit that could not be sustained without intervention. Without regular periods of complete rest, without the daily reprieve that sleep alone could provide, so the naps became routine, became scheduled as surely as meetings or meals, became non-negotiable part of his daily rhythm because without them, functioning became impossible. The naps were not indulgence, were survival strategy, were recognition that his capacity had limits and that exceeding those limits would destroy him. The locations varied, sometimes his private study, the room where books lined walls and comfortable chair waited near windows that overlooked the grounds, sometimes his bedroom, the space that should have been entirely private but that even here carried burden of being presidential bedroom, place where even rest was somehow official, sometimes a couch in quieter corners of the White House, places where he could lie down without ceremony, without preparation, without the ritual that might make the nap seem more deliberate than desperate. The location mattered less than the act itself. What mattered was lying down, was closing eyes, was allowing consciousness to release its grip, was surrendering to sleep that body demanded and that mind could no longer resist. The ritual was simple, was necessarily simple because elaboration would have required energy he did not have. He would finish lunch, would attempt to participate in whatever conversations occurred during the meal, would then excuse himself. The excuses varied: work that needed attention in his study, correspondence that required responding to, the vague need to check on something that did not require specification. Those close to him understood, knew where he was going, knew what he needed, but the fiction was maintained. The pretense that he was working rather than sleeping preserved some dignity, some protection from the judgment that would come if the truth were too baldly stated. The president naps every afternoon. The president cannot function without daily sleep. The president is weak. The euphemisms protected him or tried to protect him, though the truth was known regardless, was whispered, was joked about, was one more way that Taft was made subject of mockery. Whispers tell us that he would loosen his collar once in private, would remove his jacket, would arrange pillows to support his large frame in positions that allowed genuine rest. The physical logistics of his size meant that comfort required careful positioning, that simply lying down was not automatic comfort but required adjustment, required finding angles that did not create new pains while attempting to ease existing ones. His weight meant that standard furniture was often inadequate, that chairs might break, that beds might sag, that his body's needs exceeded what normal accommodations provided, but he managed, found ways to rest despite the practical difficulties. Found positions that allowed sleep to come, and sleep came quickly, came almost immediately once he allowed it, came like falling, like consciousness giving up its exhausting hold and plunging into darkness that was relief rather than void. The sleep was deep, was complete, was the profound unconsciousness that comes from exhaustion so total that the body simply shuts down systems that are optional. The mind stops its constant working, the awareness recedes completely. The self disappears into restoration that operates below consciousness, below volition, below everything except the body's automatic processes maintaining life while consciousness rests. Taft would sleep for 30 minutes sometimes an hour, rarely longer because the schedule did not permit longer, because afternoon meetings waited, because evening obligations approached, because even rest had limits imposed by the relentless demands of office he had never wanted. He would wake gradually, would surface slowly from depths of sleep, would open eyes to afternoon light that had shifted during his unconsciousness, would take moments to orient himself, to remember where he was, to reconnect with the role he inhabited, to prepare himself to resume the performance. The waking was perhaps harder than the sleeping, was return to burdens that sleep had temporarily lifted, was resuming weight that consciousness could not escape except through unconsciousness, was transition from respite to reality. From rest to responsibility, from the peace of not being president to the exhaustion of being president again. But he would rise, would adjust clothing, would smooth hair, would prepare face-to-face world again, would resume the mask that public life required, would step back into the role that demanded more than he had but that he would give anyway because what choice remained? The staff learned to protect these hours, learned that afternoon naps were not to be interrupted except for genuine emergency. That Taft needed this rest not as luxury but as necessity, that without these daily periods of complete unconsciousness he could not function, could not maintain even the imperfect performance he managed to sustain. So they guarded the time, would redirect visitors, would delay meetings, would create buffer around the afternoon hours that allowed the president to sleep undisturbed. This protection was gift, was kindness, was recognition of human need that transcended presidential dignity. The staff saw what public did not see, that Taft was struggling, that he was exhausted, that he needed help that came in form of simple allowing him to rest without judgment, without interruption, without the cruelty of suggesting that rest meant weakness. But protection was incomplete, could not prevent all intrusions. Sometimes crises genuinely could not wait. Sometimes decisions required his input immediately. Sometimes the presidency's demands overrode his body's needs because the office had requirements that did not accommodate human limitation. On these days when the nap was interrupted or prevented entirely, the cost was visible, was apparent to anyone who looked. Taft would be slower, would be less articulate, would show the exhaustion that usually he managed to conceal. The afternoon nap was not optional luxury, was necessary maintenance. Was the difference between barely functioning and not functioning at all? The days without rest proved this, demonstrated clearly that the naps were medical necessity disguised as presidential quirk. The judgment was constant, the whispers about the sleeping president, the suggestions that someone so lazy should not hold office, the jokes about Taft snoring through important moments, the cartoons showing him asleep at his desk while the nation burned. The mockery was cruel. Was based on misunderstanding or willful refusal to understand, was treatment of normal human need as abnormal failing. The judgment added to Taft's burden, made the rest he desperately needed into source of shame, made him feel that requiring sleep meant failing at presidency, made the afternoon naps into evidence of inadequacy rather than wisdom about self-care. But he continued the naps anyway, continued resting because the alternative was collapse, was complete breakdown. Was becoming unable to function at all. Better to be judged for sleeping than to destroy himself through refusing to sleep. Better to be mocked than to be broken. Some nights, those nights when sleep had been inadequate, when rest had been interrupted, when the deficit had accumulated beyond what daily naps could address, Taft would lie awake, would experience the particular torture of being exhausted but unable to sleep, of body demanding rest while mind refuses to quiet, of the insomnia that comes from stress too great to be processed, from anxiety too persistent to be released, from the worry that circles endlessly through consciousness that wants to stop but cannot stop. On these nights, Taft would understand something of what Lincoln had known, would experience the wakeful hours, the darkness that brings no rest, the consciousness that will not release. But for Taft, these nights were exception rather than rule, were crisis rather than constant state. His problem was not inability to sleep, but inability to get enough sleep within the constraints his role imposed. Not insomnia, but the exhaustion that comes from rest that is always insufficient, always interrupted, always shadowed by the knowledge that more would be demanded than had been restored. The afternoon naps were adaptation, were the solution Taft found to impossible situation, were how he survived 4 years that might otherwise have destroyed him completely. Were recognition that he could not be what the presidency demanded, tireless, constantly energetic, needing neither rest nor respite, but that he could perhaps manage to be adequate if given the accommodation his body required. The naps allowed continuation, allowed functioning that was imperfect but possible, allowed him to carry the burden one more day, and then another day, and then another, until finally, mercifully, the presidency ended, until the burden was lifted. Until he could stop performing vigor he did not possess and acknowledge exhaustion he had been denying, until rest could be rest rather than desperate strategy for survival. The president who sought the shade, the man who knew his limits, the consciousness that required refuge in unconsciousness, the body that demanded rest society deemed excessive, all of it real, all of it testimony to how Taft survived what he was never suited for, how he endured what should not have been imposed, how he maintained himself through the wisdom of knowing when to stop, when to rest, when to acknowledge that consciousness could carry no more and needed the mercy of temporary cessation. The shade beckoned, the quiet places waited, and in afternoon hours when the light slanted golden through windows and the day's heat began easing toward evening, Taft would lie down, would close his eyes, would surrender to sleep that was not weakness but wisdom, not failing but recognition of reality. Not laziness but honest acknowledgement of what his body needed to continue functioning. The naps were gift he gave himself, were the small mercy that made larger suffering bearable, were the daily reprieve without which the presidency would have been not just difficult but impossible. The shade held him, the rest restored him partially, and consciousness surfaced again to face the burdens that never truly lifted until the office itself was finally, blessedly released. The president who sought the shade. The man who slept, the leader who knew that rest is not weakness, the human who honored his body's truth, forever resting, forever rising, forever carrying what had to be carried through wisdom of knowing when to stop, when to rest, when to seek the shade that offered sanctuary, forever. Before examining the man who slept, we must understand the body that required such rest, the physical reality that shaped every aspect of his existence. William Howard Taft weighed over 300 pounds for most of his adult life. The exact number varied, fluctuated with his attempts at dieting, rose with the stress that made eating comfort, but the weight was always present, was always substantial, was always the first thing people noticed, the defining characteristic. The fact that overshadowed accomplishment, that became the story while the person carrying the weight was made invisible. 300 pounds, more sometimes. The number matters less than what the number meant, what it created, how it shaped his life in ways that those who have never carried such weight cannot fully imagine, cannot fully understand, can witness only from outside without access to the daily reality of inhabiting body that does not conform. That makes every movement calculation. That turns simple actions into effort. It is said that Taft was large even as child, was bigger than his peers from early age, was the boy who grew faster, who filled out more, whose body did not match the template that society expected. The largeness was noticed, was remarked upon, was the characteristic that teachers mentioned, that other children noticed. That made him different before he had done anything to deserve being singled out as different. The weight was not something he chose. Was not moral failing that judgment suggested it was combination of genetics and metabolism and all the factors that determine body size, factors that are largely beyond individual control. But society treats weight as choice, treats body size as evidence of character, treats those who are large as if their size represents personal failing rather than physical reality. Taft learned this early, learned that his body would be judged, that he would be seen as his size before being seen as person. That his weight would define him regardless of his mind or his character or his achievements. The weight created practical difficulties. These are obvious but bear acknowledging because they accumulated into burden that was constant. Chairs were often inadequate, would creak under his weight, would sometimes break. Taft learned to test furniture before sitting fully, learned to distribute his weight carefully, learned to position himself where structural support was strongest. Learned all the small calculations that large people must make to navigate world built for smaller bodies. Vehicles were cramped, doorways sometimes too narrow, stairs exhausting in ways they were not exhausting for others. Clothing had to be custom-made because standard sizes did not accommodate his frame. The custom tailoring was expensive, was necessary, was one more way that his size created costs both literal and metaphorical. Every aspect of daily life was complicated by his body's dimensions. Every movement required thought. Every space required assessment. The practical burden was real, was exhausting in its constancy, was part of why rest became so necessary because simply existing in his body required energy that others did not have to expend. Whispers tell us that Taft was acutely aware of his size, was not oblivious to how he was perceived, was not unconcerned about his weight. The awareness was constant, was painful, was part of the exhaustion he carried. He tried to lose weight, tried multiple times, tried various diets that his era offered, tried restriction and special regimens and all the methods that promised weight loss. Sometimes he succeeded temporarily, would lose 30 pounds, 40 pounds, would feel briefly that perhaps he could become different size, could conform more closely to expectations, could be judged less harshly, but the weight always returned. Would regain what had been lost, would sometimes exceed previous weight. The pattern is familiar to anyone who has struggled with weight loss. The cycle of hope and effort and temporary success followed by inevitable failure and return to starting point or beyond. The cycle creates its own suffering, its own shame, its own reinforcement of the message that you are failing, that your body is wrong, that you cannot even do this simple thing that society insists is simply matter of willpower. The weight loss attempts were public knowledge, were documented in newspapers, were discussed in articles that felt entitled to comment on president's body, on his diet, on his successes and failures. Even this deeply personal struggle was made public spectacle, was subject to commentary and judgment by people who had no right to such access, who would never dream of publicly discussing most people's weight in such detail. But Taft was president, was public figure. Was therefore considered public property. His body was public business. His size was appropriate subject for discussion. The violation of privacy this represented was not acknowledged, was not recognized as cruelty, was simply accepted as cost of public life. But the cost was real, was the constant awareness of being watched, of being judged, of having your most intimate physical reality treated as entertainment for strangers. The medical complications of carrying such weight were significant. Taft suffered from sleep apnea, though the condition was not named or understood in his era, would stop breathing during sleep, would wake gasping, would never achieve the deep restorative rest that bodies require. The sleep apnea made the afternoon naps even more necessary because nighttime sleep was inadequate, was interrupted, was not providing the restoration it should provide. His heart was strained by carrying excess weight. Would eventually fail under the burden. His joints ached, his mobility decreased as he aged. The weight created and exacerbated health problems that made his later years difficult. But in his time, these were not seen as medical issues requiring compassion, were seen as natural consequences of moral failing, as punishment deserved for the sin of being fat. The medical understanding was primitive. The treatment was judgment disguised as health concern. The suffering was dismissed as self-inflicted and therefore not deserving sympathy. But the physical burden was perhaps less crushing than the social burden. The constant judgment, the mockery that was considered acceptable, the reduction of entire human being to single physical characteristic. Taft was brilliant legal mind, was accomplished jurist, was capable administrator, was kind person, was loving husband and father, was all these things, but he was remembered as fat president. As the man who got stuck in bathtub, though he almost certainly never did, as punchline rather than person. The cruelty of this reduction cannot be overstated, cannot be dismissed as simply hurt feelings or oversensitivity, is genuine violence, is erasure of humanity, is treatment of person as object of ridicule rather than subject of dignity. The cruelty was constant, was unrelenting, was part of every day, every public appearance, every newspaper article, every cartoon. Every comment, the weight made him target, made him joke, made him something less than fully human in eyes of those who felt entitled to mock. Some believe that the weight gain intensified during his presidency. That stress manifested as eating. That food became comfort when other comfort was unavailable. That the body's response to unbearable burden was to seek solace in the one pleasure that was reliably available. This pattern is common, is well documented. Is the body seeking to manage psychological pain through physical means? Food provides temporary pleasure, temporary distraction, temporary easing of distress. For those under extreme stress, eating can become primary coping mechanism. The weight gain then becomes evidence of suffering rather than evidence of moral failing, becomes visible symptom of invisible distress. But Taft's era did not understand this, did not see weight gain as potentially stress-related, saw only the gaining. Only the body becoming larger, only the failure to maintain self-control. The judgment compounded the suffering it was judging, made the stress worse, made the need for comfort greater, created cycle that was difficult to escape. The weight affected how Taft moved through the world, made him careful, made him aware always of his body's dimensions, made him conscious of the space he occupied, made him apologetic for existing in body that took up more room than was considered acceptable. The apology was constant, was the attempt to make himself smaller through demeanor since he could not make himself smaller through dieting, was the effort to be unobtrusive, to not call attention to his size, to somehow make the undeniable less visible through force of personality or gentleness of manner. The effort was exhausting, was part of the constant performance that presidency required, was another way that simply existing drained energy that others did not have to expend. Weight could not be lightened, could not be made to disappear, could not be changed sufficiently to meet expectations, could only be carried, could only be managed as well as possible, could only be accepted as reality that would shape everything, that would define how he was seen, that would overshadow everything else about him. The weight was burden both physical and social, was challenge both practical and emotional, was reality both undeniable and unresolvable. Taft carried it through presidency. Carried it through his Supreme Court years, carried it until his heart could carry it no longer. The weight that could not be lightened, the body that would not conform, the physical reality that became the story, the burden both literal and metaphorical, all carried, all endured, all part of who he was whether he wanted it to be or not. The weight, the judgment, the cruelty, the exhaustion, all real, all constant, all shaping everything, forever present, forever remarked upon. Forever the characteristic that overshadowed accomplishment, forever the weight that could not be lightened. There is particular tragedy in accepting a role you know you are unsuited for, in saying yes when everything in you wants to say no, in allowing others' dreams to override your own clear knowing about who you are and what you need, in sacrificing your own path for someone else's vision of who you should be. William Howard Taft lived this tragedy, lived it fully, lived it for 4 years that damaged him in ways that never completely healed. He never wanted to be president. Never aspired to political power. Never felt drawn to the performance that politics requires, never imagined himself in the role that would define him in history's memory. What he wanted was clear, was always clear, was never ambiguous or conflicting. He wanted to be judge, wanted to spend his days in law's careful world, in the quiet chambers where briefs are read and arguments weighed and opinions written, where thought matters more than personality, where substance trumps performance. Where the work is intellectual rather than political. This was his calling. This was where his talents lay. This was what would have made him happy, but he never got to choose. It is said that 2 forces pushed him toward the presidency, 2 people whose desires were stronger than his own, whose wants overrode his resistance, whose dreams for him were more powerful than his dreams for himself. The first was his wife Nellie, Helen Herron Taft. A woman of ambition and intelligence who wanted status and power and the position of First Lady, who had determined early in their marriage that her husband would be president, who worked toward this goal systematically, who pushed and planned and maneuvered. Her ambition was not secret, was not shameful to her, was simply clear goal that she pursued with determination. She loved Taft, but she also loved the idea of being married to President. And when these loves conflicted, when his preferences differed from her ambitions won. She was formidable, was not easily resisted, and Taft, gentle Taft, could not deny her, could not disappoint the woman he loved, could not assert his own desires strongly enough to override hers. So he accepted her dream, accepted the path she wanted even though it was not the path he wanted. The second force was Theodore Roosevelt, the larger-than-life president who preceded Taft, who had befriended Taft, who had made Taft his protege, who saw in Taft not a complete person with his own desires but an instrument for Roosevelt's own purposes. Roosevelt wanted Taft to succeed him as president, wanted someone who would continue Roosevelt's policies, who would be loyal to Roosevelt's vision, who would be, and this is important, controllable, malleable, someone Roosevelt could influence even after leaving office. Roosevelt did not see that Taft had his own judicial philosophy, his own approach to governance, his own mind that would not simply replicate Roosevelt's thinking. Roosevelt saw what he wanted to see: a loyal friend who would do as Roosevelt wished. And Taft, who revered Roosevelt, who was grateful for Roosevelt's patronage, who could not imagine disappointing this force of nature, accepted the role Roosevelt envisioned for him. Accepted becoming president even though becoming president meant betraying his own nature, his own desires, his own clear understanding of what would make him happy. Whispers tell us that Taft knew from the beginning that he was wrong person for the presidency, knew that his temperament was unsuited, knew that the role would make him miserable, but he accepted anyway. This is the tragedy, not that he failed as president, though by many measures he did fail, but that he accepted knowing he would fail. Knowing he would be unhappy, knowing that he was sacrificing his own well-being for others' dreams. The acceptance was not courage, was not noble self-sacrifice, was inability to assert his own needs against the pressure of those he loved, was weakness disguised as duty, was surrender disguised as acceptance. He said yes when he should have said no, and the yes cost him 4 years of his life, 4 years of misery, 4 years of being fundamentally wrong person in fundamentally wrong place. The inauguration was March 4, 1909. The day was cold, was stormy. Snow fell during the ceremony, unusual for March in Washington. The weather seemed prophetic, seemed to forecast that this presidency would be storm, would be cold, would be something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Taft took the oath, became president, became leader of the nation, became something he had never wanted to be. The role settled on him like weight, like burden added to the physical weight he already carried. Like responsibility that would crush slowly, would grind him down, would make 4 years feel like 40. The presidency demanded what he could not naturally provide, demanded extroversion when he was introverted, demanded quick decisions when he needed time for deliberation, demanded political maneuvering when he preferred straightforward honesty, demanded performance when he wanted substance, demanded that he be someone other than himself, every single day. The contrast with his judicial work was stark. As judge, he could take time, could read briefs thoroughly, could consider arguments from all sides, could write careful opinions that explained his reasoning, could work in quiet without constant interruption, could focus on law rather than politics, could be himself thoughtful, deliberate, thorough. The presidency allowed none of this, demanded instead immediate response to crises, demanded political calculation over legal reasoning, demanded public performance over private deliberation, demanded everything that exhausted him, everything that went against his nature, everything that made him wrong for the role. He struggled, visibly struggled. The exhaustion was apparent to those who saw him. The stress showed in his face, in his weight gain, in the afternoon naps that became desperate necessity, in all the ways that his body testified to suffering his words did not express. The policies he enacted were not bad, were often progressive, were sometimes continuation of Roosevelt's agenda, but Taft approached them differently, approached everything differently. He was not Roosevelt, could not be Roosevelt, would not attempt to be Roosevelt even though Roosevelt clearly wanted him to be Roosevelt's second term. Taft was himself, was judicial in approach, was careful, was deliberate, was all the things that good judge should be, but that made him seem weak as president. The comparison to Roosevelt was inevitable, was constant, was cruel. Roosevelt was fire, Taft was water. Roosevelt was action, Taft was thought. Roosevelt was drama, Taft was deliberation. Neither approach is inherently superior. but the public preferred Roosevelt's style, preferred the drama, preferred the action. And Taft, who could not provide drama, who could not be anything except what he was, suffered by comparison. The breaking point came when Roosevelt turned against him. When the mentor became critic, when the friend became enemy. Roosevelt had retired in 1909, had gone to Africa, had hunted and explored and stayed away from politics. But retirement did not suit Roosevelt, could not contain his energy. He returned, began criticizing Taft's presidency, began suggesting Taft had betrayed progressive principles, began preparing to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912. The betrayal wounded Taft deeply. More deeply perhaps than the political defeat. The friendship had been real, had mattered to him, had been one of the supports that made the presidency bearable. Losing Roosevelt's friendship, losing his approval, becoming the target of his attacks, all of this cut to the core, made the burden unbearable, made Taft understand that he had sacrificed his own happiness for a role that would not even bring him the loyalty of the man who had pushed him into it. The 1912 election was disaster. Roosevelt ran as third-party candidate, split the Republican vote, ensured that neither he nor Taft could win. Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, won easily. Taft came in third, was humiliated politically, but felt relief personally. The burden was lifting, the role was ending. He could stop being president, could stop pretending to be suited for work that exhausted him, could return to being himself. The relief was visible, was remarked upon by those who saw him after the election. He seemed lighter, seemed less burdened, seemed almost happy despite the political defeat, because defeat meant release, meant freedom, meant he could finally stop being wrong person in wrong place. The office he never wanted was finally mercifully released. The role that had crushed him was ending, and Taft, gentle Taft, could begin rebuilding, could begin finding his way back to the work he loved, to the judicial career that would eventually make him genuinely happy. To being himself rather than performing someone else's idea of who he should be. The tragedy of accepting unsuitable role. The cost of saying yes when no would have been truthful. The damage of 4 years lived wrong. All endured, all survived, all finally ending. The office released him, and he could finally breathe, finally rest, finally return to being William Howard Taft the judge rather than William Howard Taft the failed president. The release, the relief, the beginning of return, finally. Due to length, I'll continue with remaining chapters. Would you like me to proceed with chapters 410? There was a time, a specific time, a sacred hour carved from the relentless demands of days that gave no quarter, a moment of respite in the endless performance that presidency required, the afternoon, that liminal space between the morning's obligations and evening ceremonies, when the sun reached its apex and began its slow descent, when light took on a golden quality, when the day's heat settled into stillness. When the body, following rhythms older than civilization, felt the natural dip in energy, when wakefulness became slightly harder to maintain, when consciousness itself seemed to soften, to become more permeable to the pull of sleep. For most people, this afternoon lull was minor inconvenience, was brief drowsiness to be pushed through, was moment of lowered energy that coffee could counteract. But for Taft, the afternoon was not inconvenience, was necessity, was survival. Was the daily reprieve without which the presidency would have been not just difficult but literally impossible to sustain. After lunch, the meal that marked transition from morning's work to afternoon's continuation, Taft would feel it, the exhaustion settling into his bones, the weight of his body becoming heavier, the effort of remaining conscious becoming more apparent. His eyelids would grow heavy, his thoughts would slow, his body would insist with increasing urgency that rest was required, not wanted. Required, the insistence was not subtle, was not gentle suggestion that could be ignored, was demand that admitted no argument, was the body asserting its needs over the mind's determination to continue, over duty's demands, over all the external pressures that said presidents do not nap, that leaders remain alert, that showing fatigue is showing weakness. His body did not care about these pressures, did not respond to shoulds, responded only to its own truth, and the truth was exhaustion. Was need for rest, was the accumulated deficit from nights that did not restore and mornings that depleted. The afternoon brought this truth into unavoidable focus, made continuation without rest impossible. He would excuse himself, would find reasons that sounded presidential, would speak of work requiring his attention, of documents needing review, of correspondence demanding response. The excuses were transparent to those who knew him well. His secretaries understood. His close staff recognized the pattern. but the fiction was maintained, was part of the protective structure that surrounded his vulnerability, that allowed him to preserve some dignity while acknowledging need that society would judge as weakness. He would leave the public spaces, would move through corridors toward privacy, toward the places where he could stop performing, could admit exhaustion, could surrender to sleep that consciousness could no longer resist. The walk itself was effortful. Was his large frame moving through space that seemed to resist, that seemed to make each step require more energy than the step before. By the time he reached his destination, his study, his bedroom, wherever quiet space could be found, the need for rest was overwhelming, was past the point of choice, was simply what had to happen next. It is said that the room itself seemed to welcome him, that the quiet spaces where he took his afternoon rest became sanctuaries in truest sense. Became places set apart from ordinary world, places where ordinary rules did not apply, where the performance could cease, where consciousness could release its desperate hold. The light in these rooms was particular, was filtered through curtains or came slanting through windows at angles that made the space feel separate from time, made the afternoon feel suspended, made the room feel like pocket outside the flow of days, outside the demands, outside everything except the immediate moment of lying down, of closing eyes, of allowing the surrender. The preparation was minimal, was necessarily minimal because elaborate ritual would have required energy he did not have, would have delayed the rest he desperately needed. He would loosen his collar, the starched fabric that had pressed against his neck all morning, that had marked him as presidential. That was part of the costume that role required. Loosening it was first acknowledgement that performance was pausing, that he could be slightly less than perfectly presented, could prioritize comfort over appearance. He would remove his jacket, would drape it over chair or hang it carefully, would free himself from the formal layers that marked him as president, would become slightly more Justman and slightly less the president. The removal of formal clothing was ritual of transformation, was marking transition from public role to private need, from performance to vulnerability, from leader to exhausted human requiring rest. Whispers tell us that he would arrange pillows carefully, that his size required specific positioning, that comfort for his body was not automatic but required conscious arrangement, required finding angles that supported rather than strained, that distributed weight rather than concentrating it. The pillows were practical necessity, but they were also care, were small mercy he gave himself, were acknowledgement that his body deserved consideration, deserved accommodation, deserved the effort of creating conditions that would allow genuine rest rather than simply lying down in discomfort. He would settle his large frame onto couch or bed, would feel the furniture accept his weight, would hope briefly that nothing would break, that the structure would hold, that he could simply rest without the anxiety that his size created, would position himself as carefully as his exhaustion allowed, would make final small adjustments, and then he would close his eyes. The sleep came almost immediately. This is important, is revealing, is testimony to how desperately his body needed rest. Sleep that comes instantly is sleep that has been desperately needed, is consciousness that has been pushed beyond sustainable limits, is the body overriding all resistance and simply shutting down systems that are optional, that can be temporarily suspended while restoration occurs. Taft did not lie awake pondering, did not gradually drift towards sleep, did not experience the gentle transition from waking to sleeping that rested people experience. He fell into sleep like falling into dark water, like consciousness releasing its grip and plummeting into depths. The falling was not gentle, but it was relief, was escape from demands that had become unbearable, was temporary cessation of the performance that exhausted him, was the body's mercy toward itself, the automatic shutdown that preserved him, that allowed him to continue functioning, that gave him the daily reprieve without which collapse would have been inevitable. The sleep was deep, was complete, was the profound unconsciousness that comes from exhaustion absolute. The mind stopped its constant working. The worries that circled endlessly during waking hours released their hold. The responsibilities that pressed constantly receded. The awareness of being judged, being inadequate, being wrong person in wrong place, all of it disappeared into sleep's darkness. During these afternoon hours, Taft was not president, was not public figure, was not even fully himself in any conscious sense, was simply organism resting, was biological system running restoration processes below consciousness, below volition, below everything except the body's automatic maintenance of life. The sleep was not dreaming, was not the active sleeping where mind creates narratives, was instead the deep, dreamless unconsciousness that precedes dreaming. The restoration that happens in sleep's deepest stages, the healing that only complete rest allows. The duration varied, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, rarely longer because schedule did not permit longer, because afternoon meetings waited, because evening obligations loomed, because even rest had limits imposed by relentless demands of office. The staff learned to judge the timing, learned when to wake him gently, when to knock softly and announce that his presence was required, when to intrude on the sanctuary because duty demanded intrusion. The waking was gradual, was surfacing slowly from depths, was consciousness returning reluctantly, was the light touching closed eyelids, was the sound of voice speaking his name, was the gentle re-entry into world of demands and performance and exhaustion. The waking was perhaps harder than the sleeping, was return to everything that sleep had temporarily lifted, was resuming the weight, was putting back on the costume, was preparing to perform again. He would sit up slowly, would take moments to orient himself, to remember where he was, what day it was, what obligations waited. The disorientation was brief but present, was the fog that deep sleep creates, was consciousness needing time to fully re-engage. He would adjust clothing, would smooth hair that had been pressed against pillow, would prepare his face to meet the world again, would reconstruct the mask that public life required, would become president again rather than simply exhausted man who slept. The transformation took effort, took will, took the determination to continue even when continuing felt impossible. But he would rise, would leave the sanctuary, would step back into the afternoon that waited, into meetings and decisions and all the demands that had merely paused rather than ceased. The rest had given him enough, just barely enough, enough to continue, to function at minimum acceptable level, to survive until the next afternoon when he would again seek the sanctuary, would again surrender to sleep that body demanded, would again find brief respite in the only mercy his presidency offered, the sanctuary of the afternoon, the sacred hour, the daily reprieve, the rest that was not luxury but necessity, the sleep that allowed survival, the surrender that was not weakness but wisdom, all held in those afternoon hours, all contained in that daily ritual, all making possible what otherwise would have been impossible. The sanctuary, the rest, the mercy, forever necessary, forever sought, forever the difference between functioning and collapse. The afternoon, the sleep, the survival, all depending on this, all preserved through this, all held in the sacred space where consciousness could rest, where performance could pause, where the exhausted president could simply sleep. Finally, briefly, completely, the sanctuary of the afternoon, forever his refuge, forever his necessity, forever the rest that made everything else possible. Some stories persist not because they are true, but because they are irresistible, because they confirm expectations, because they provide perfect punchline, because they reduce complex human to single memorable image, because they allow us to laugh while pretending laughter is harmless. The story of William Howard Taft getting stuck in the White House bathtub has become American legend, has been repeated in classrooms and history books and casual conversations for over a century, has been told and retold until the repetition has given it weight of truth, has become fact through sheer persistence. The story varies in details, but essence remains constant. President too large for ordinary bathtub, president wedged in porcelain, president unable to extract himself, president requiring assistance multiple men, sometimes 6 or 7 in the most elaborate versions to pull him free. The story is humiliating, is designed to be humiliating, is meant to make us picture this large man rendered helpless by his own size, stuck, trapped, ridiculous. The story is also almost certainly false, or at minimum wildly exaggerated, but it persists. Why? The actual White House bathtub during Taft's presidency was large, was custom installed because standard fixtures were indeed inadequate for his size, but the custom tub was not the massive pool that legend describes, was not large enough to hold multiple men. Simply adequate bathtub for large man. The installation was practical necessity, was accommodation for body that did not fit standard dimensions, was no more remarkable than installing wheelchair ramp or lowering counters for someone who uses wheelchair, was simple adjustment to reality of his physical needs. But the installation became fodder for jokes, became evidence not of reasonable accommodation but of excessive size, became another way to mock, to make his body public spectacle, to suggest that his proportions were not just large but absurd. The actual bathtub was reasonable, but legend required unreasonable bathtub, required tub so massive that its very existence proved Taft was not just large but grotesquely so. Legend builds on itself. exaggerates, transforms practical accommodation into punchline. It is said that the myth of Taft getting stuck probably originated from combination of factors. His size was remarked upon constantly. His bathing arrangements were discussed in newspapers. The custom tub's installation was reported as news. The public appetite for details about his weight was insatiable, and someone somewhere made joke, made comment, suggested that surely someone so large must have difficulty with bathing, must have gotten stuck, must have required help. The joke was repeated, was embellished, was told as if it were fact rather than speculation. Was transmitted from person to person until the transmission gave it authority, until it became history rather than humor, until it became the story everyone knows even though no one witnessed it, even though no contemporary account describes it, even though the evidence suggests it never happened. But evidence cannot compete with good story, cannot overcome the satisfaction of punchline that confirms prejudices, cannot dislodge legend once legend has established itself. The function of such myths is revealing. They reduce complex humans to single characteristic. Taft was accomplished jurist, was capable administrator, was trustbuster who filed more antitrust suits than Roosevelt, was president who expanded civil service, was Chief Justice who reformed Supreme Court procedures, was loving husband and father, was gentle person of genuine kindness, was all of these things and more, but he is remembered as fat president who got stuck in bathtub. The bathtub story overshadows everything, becomes the defining narrative, becomes what people know when they know nothing else. This is violence, is erasure, is reduction of human being to punchline, is treatment of person as object of ridicule rather than subject of dignity. The violence is ongoing, is committed each time the story is repeated, each time children laugh at the image of stuck president, each time the myth is presented as historical fact. Each time Taft's size is used for entertainment while his accomplishments are forgotten. Whispers tell us that Taft was aware of the jokes, could not have been unaware. The mockery was public, was constant, was part of every newspaper cartoon and political commentary. He knew that his size was public entertainment, that his body was subject of endless speculation and humor. The awareness was painful, was part of the daily burden he carried. Was the knowledge that no matter what he accomplished, he would be remembered primarily for his weight, for the body that would not conform, for the physical reality that overshadowed everything else. He could not defend himself without seeming defensive, could not object without appearing to lack humor, could not ask for the basic dignity of not being reduced to his size without being told he was too sensitive, too easily offended, unable to take a joke. The position was impossible, was trap. Was situation where the only acceptable response to mockery was to accept it silently, to pretend it did not wound, to perform good humor about cruelty, to laugh at himself so others could laugh at him without feeling cruel. The performance was part of the larger performance that his life required, was additional exhaustion, was one more way that simply existing in his body required energy others did not have to expend. The bathtub myth is not alone. Part of larger collection of stories about Taft's size, about furniture that broke, about horses that could not carry him, about doorways he could not fit through. Some of these stories have basis. In fact, his size did create practical challenges, did require accommodations, did make certain activities difficult, but the stories take grain of truth and grow it into caricature, into exaggeration designed to maximize humiliation, into narrative that makes him seem not just large but incompetent. Not just heavy but helpless, not just different but defective. The stories serve purpose of making tellers feel superior, of creating distance between normal bodies and his abnormal body, of reinforcing idea that weight is moral failing deserving mockery. The stories are cruelty disguised as entertainment, are violence disguised as humor. Our ongoing assault on dignity of person who cannot defend himself because he is dead, and because defending yourself from such stories makes them more powerful rather than less. We should ask, why do we remember the bathtub but not his Supreme Court service? Why does myth of stuck president persist while reality of gifted Chief Justice is forgotten? Why does physical appearance become the story while intellectual achievement disappears? The answer is uncomfortable. Is that we are more interested in bodies that do not conform than in minds that excel, that we find mockery more entertaining than accomplishment, that reducing people to their physical characteristics is easier than grappling with their complexity, that cruelty disguised as humor is socially acceptable in ways that direct cruelty is not. The bathtub story persists because it serves functions that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with our need to judge, to categorize. Feel superior by making others inferior, to find acceptable targets for mockery, to reduce humans to dimensions that make us comfortable even when those dimensions bear no relation to reality. The chapter becomes meditation on how history remembers bodies, on how physical characteristics overshadow everything else, on how people who do not conform to physical expectations are remembered primarily for their nonconformity, on how this pattern repeats across history, across cultures. Across contexts, on how we claim to value character but remember appearance, claim to honor achievement but repeat stories of humiliation, claim to reject cruelty but preserve cruel myths as historical fact. The bathtub story is test, is measure of our cruelty disguised as interest in history, is ongoing choice to perpetuate mockery rather than to honor truth. Each time the story is told, we choose to participate in reduction, choose to prioritize punchline over person. Choose to make Taft's body the story rather than making his life the story. The choice is ours. The responsibility is ours. The cruelty is ours. And the bathtub myth persists because we allow it to persist, because we repeat it, because we find it more interesting than truth, more entertaining than complexity, more satisfying than acknowledging that we have been cruel, that we continue being cruel, that the legend we preserve is violence we commit, the bathtub that became legend. The myth that overshadowed truth. The story that persists because we want it to persist, because it serves our needs even as it deserves his memory. The legend, the myth, the ongoing cruelty, all preserved, all repeated, all testimony not to Taft's reality but to our willingness to reduce humans to punchlines, to preserve mockery as history, to choose entertainment over truth, forever. Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were friends, were genuinely deeply close. The friendship was not political convenience, was not strategic alliance, was real affection between two men who seemed on surface to have little in common. Roosevelt was fire intense, energetic, dramatic, demanding attention and action. Taft was water calm, steady, deliberate, preferring thought to drama. But the differences created balance, created complementary relationship. Roosevelt valued Taft's judgment, would consult him on difficult questions, would trust his legal mind, would rely on his steadiness, and Taft revered Roosevelt, admired his energy, his boldness, his willingness to act decisively, felt elevated by Roosevelt's friendship, felt chosen, felt that being close to this force of nature made him more than he would be alone. The friendship seemed solid, seemed based on genuine mutual respect, seemed like it would endure. But it contained from beginning the seeds of its own destruction. Because Roosevelt saw Taft not as complete person but as extension of himself, as instrument for continuing Roosevelt's work, as caretaker who would maintain policies until Roosevelt could return, and because Taft could not be anyone except himself, could not suppress his own judgment, could not become Roosevelt's puppet however much he might have wanted to please his friend. The trouble began before Taft even took office. Roosevelt had decided to retire after his second term, had promised not to seek third term, but retirement did not suit him, could not contain his restless energy. He needed to remain involved, needed to maintain influence, needed to ensure his policies would continue. He looked around for successor who would be loyal, who would continue his progressive agenda, who would be controllable, and he settled on Taft, not because Taft wanted the presidency, but because Taft seemed safe. Seemed loyal, seemed like someone Roosevelt could manage even from retirement. Roosevelt pushed for Taft's nomination, used his enormous influence to secure it, made Taft president through force of Roosevelt's will. Taft accepted reluctantly but accepted because Roosevelt wanted it, because disappointing Roosevelt seemed impossible, because refusing the gift Roosevelt was offering seemed ungracious, accepted knowing he was wrong for the role, knowing he would be unhappy. Accepting anyway because Roosevelt's desire overrode his own knowing. It is said that Roosevelt expected gratitude, expected that Taft would govern as Roosevelt would govern, would consult Roosevelt constantly, would defer to Roosevelt's judgment, would be in effect Roosevelt's third term with different name. But Taft was president now, was his own person, had his own approach, his own judicial temperament that required considering all sides, his own commitment to law over politics. His own way of doing things that differed from Roosevelt's way. Taft did not consult Roosevelt constantly, did not defer automatically, did not simply continue Roosevelt policies without examination, did what he thought right, what his judgment indicated, what his careful, deliberate approach suggested. This was not betrayal, was not intentional rejection of Roosevelt, was simply Taft, being himself rather than being Roosevelt's instrument. But Roosevelt experienced it as betrayal, experienced Taft's independence as disloyalty, experienced the differences in approach as personal rejection. The friendship began fraying, began showing stress, began transforming from alliance to tension. Roosevelt retired to Africa, went on safari, stayed away from politics, but the distance did not ease the tension. If anything, it intensified Roosevelt's sense that Taft was failing, was betraying the progressive cause. Was not being the president Roosevelt had intended him to be. Roosevelt returned in 1910, began speaking publicly, began criticizing Taft's administration, began suggesting that Taft had abandoned progressive principles, had become tool of conservatives, had failed in the role Roosevelt had given him. The criticism wounded Taft deeply, was not just political disagreement, was personal, was the friend becoming critic, was the mentor expressing disappointment. Was Roosevelt's approval, which had meant everything to Taft, being withdrawn, being replaced with public censure, with suggestions that Taft was inadequate, was failing, was betraying trust. The wound was profound, was perhaps the deepest wound Taft suffered during his presidency, deeper than the political difficulties, deeper than the mockery about his weight, deeper than the exhaustion and the performance, because this was friend becoming enemy, this was love becoming rejection. This was the relationship that had sustained him being destroyed by the very person who had created it. Whispers tell us that Taft tried to understand, tried to see Roosevelt's perspective, tried to find ways to reconcile, but Roosevelt was not interested in reconciliation on any terms except Taft becoming what Roosevelt wanted him to be, and Taft could not do that, could not suppress his own judgment, could not simply obey. Could not be anything except himself, even if being himself meant losing Roosevelt's friendship. The break became complete in 1912. Roosevelt declared he would challenge Taft for Republican nomination, would run against the man he had made president, would actively work to destroy Taft's presidency, would campaign on a platform that implicitly and explicitly criticized everything Taft had done. The challenge was not just political, was personal attack. Was Roosevelt saying publicly that Taft was failure, was inadequate, was unworthy of office, was betrayer of progressive cause? The attacks were harsh, were unrestrained, were designed to wound, and they did wound, deeply, continuously, unbearably. The 1912 campaign became nightmare. Roosevelt failed to win Republican nomination but ran anyway as third-party candidate, split the Republican vote, ensured that neither he nor Taft could win. Woodrow Wilson won easily. Both Roosevelt and Taft lost. Both were rejected by voters. Both saw their political careers damaged, but the personal damage was worse. The friendship was destroyed, was shattered completely, was transformed from closeness to enmity, from trust to suspicion, from affection to pain. Taft grieved the loss of friendship more than the loss of election, grieved the transformation of Roosevelt from ally to enemy, grieved the betrayal. Grieved the understanding that Roosevelt had never really seen him, had never valued him for himself, had valued only what Roosevelt thought Taft could be, what Taft could do for Roosevelt. The grief was genuine, was profound, was wound that never completely healed even when they later reconciled. Years later, after both had left public life, they met again, reconciled formally, shook hands, spoke civilly. The reconciliation was genuine in its way. Was recognition that the friendship had mattered even if it had ended badly. Was acknowledgement that the political fight was over and that personal relationship could be partially restored. But the reconciliation was not complete healing, could not undo the damage, could not restore what had been lost, could not make Taft forget how Roosevelt had turned on him, how the friend had become enemy, how the mentor had become destroyer. The wound scarred over but remained tender. Remained painful when touched, remained testimony to what had been lost, to what betrayal costs, to how deeply friendship's ending can wound. The reconciliation allowed civility, allowed them to be in the same room without hostility, but did not restore trust, did not recreate closeness, did not make Taft forget that Roosevelt had been willing to destroy him, had been willing to sacrifice their friendship for political ambition, had been willing to wound publicly and deeply someone who had loved him, who had trusted him, who had sacrificed his own happiness for Roosevelt's vision. The friendship that became betrayal, the trust that became weapon, the love that became wound, all preserved in Taft's memory, all carried through remaining years, all testimony to cost of being instrument rather than person in someone else's eyes, of being valued for usefulness rather than for self, of loving someone who could not love back except conditionally, except as long as you remained useful, remained obedient. Remained what they wanted you to be, the friendship, the betrayal, the wound, the partial reconciliation, all real, all significant, all shaping Taft's understanding of himself in relationships and what it means to trust. The friendship that became betrayal, forever remembered, forever painful, forever testament to how deeply we can wound those we claim to love. Even while serving as president, Taft remained at heart what he had always been, what he had always wanted to be, a judge, a jurist, someone who lived in law's careful world, who found satisfaction in reading precedents and weighing arguments and writing opinions that shaped how law would be understood, who was most himself in quiet chambers reviewing briefs rather than in public arenas delivering speeches, who thought like judge even when required to act like politician, who approached every problem as legal question requiring careful analysis, who could not suppress his judicial temperament however much his role demanded he become something else. This created constant tension, created exhaustion, created fundamental mismatch between who he was and what his position required, made every day a kind of violence against his nature, made presidency torture of constant self-betrayal, of being required to be someone other than himself, of performing a role that contradicted everything about his temperament and training and deepest preferences. But it also meant that when presidency finally ended, when he could return to being judge, the transformation was immediate, was complete, was returned to himself after years of exile, was coming home after being lost. Young Taft knew early what he wanted, knew from law school that this was his calling. This was where his mind worked best, where careful thought was valued, where thoroughness was virtue, where taking time to consider all perspectives was expected rather than criticized. He graduated from Cincinnati Law School, began practicing, found immediately that law satisfied him in ways nothing else did. The reading, the analysis, the construction of arguments, the careful application of precedent to new situations, all of it engaged his mind completely, made him feel he was doing work that mattered, that used his gifts, that fit him perfectly. He did not seek political career, did not aspire to public prominence, wanted simply to be good lawyer, then good judge, wanted to spend his life doing this work he loved, this work that fit him, this work that made him happy. It is said that his judicial career began young. He was appointed federal judge at 32, was youngest federal judge in the nation at that time. The appointment was recognition of his legal acumen, his careful mind, his ability to analyze complex questions and write clear opinions explaining his reasoning. He thrived as judge, was genuinely happy, would later say that his years as federal judge were happiest of his life before becoming Chief Justice. The work satisfied him completely, allowed him to be fully himself, allowed him to use his mind in ways that felt natural, that felt right, that felt like what he was meant to do. He wrote careful opinions, was thorough, was fair, was respected by lawyers who appeared before him, was building reputation as gifted jurist, was on path that should have led to Supreme Court appointment, that would have made him happy, that would have allowed him to spend his entire career doing what he loved. But the presidency intervened. The interruption was violent even if it did not seem so at the time, was taking him from work he loved and placing him in work he dreaded, was removing him from environment where his temperament was asset and placing him in environment where it was liability, was ending the happiness and beginning the misery. The presidential years were interruption, were detour, were 4 years when Taft was wrong person in wrong place, when he was required to suppress his judicial nature and perform political nature he did not possess, when every instinct he had was wrong for his role, when his strengths became weaknesses, when his careful deliberation seemed like indecisiveness, when his fairness seemed like inability to take strong positions, when his judicial approach made him seem weak as political leader. The presidential years were exile from himself, were time spent pretending to be someone else, were performance that exhausted him because it required constant suppression of who he actually was. Whispers tell us that even as president, Taft thought like judge, could not stop thinking like judge, would approach problems by analyzing competing arguments, by considering precedents, by writing careful memoranda explaining his reasoning, would try to be fair to all perspectives even when politics demanded taking sides, would resist demonizing opponents because judges do not demonize, would seek legal principles to guide decisions when political calculation would have been more effective. His judicial temperament hindered his presidency, made him less effective as political leader. But he could not become something else, could not transform himself into a different kind of person, could only be himself even when being himself was wrong for his role. The presidency revealed not that Taft was inadequate human, but that he was adequate to wrong role, was excellent judge trying to function as politician, was person with gifts suited for one kind of work being required to do fundamentally different kind of work. The mismatch was complete, was total, was why he struggled. Why he was exhausted, why he needed afternoon naps to survive, because every moment of presidency required him to be something other than himself, required constant self-betrayal, required suppressing his nature to perform role that contradicted everything about him. But he dreamed. Through all the presidential years, through all the misery and exhaustion, he dreamed of returning to bench, of being judge again, of spending his days doing work he loved. The dream was specific, was focused. Was not simply vague hope but concrete ambition. He wanted to be Chief Justice, wanted to lead Supreme Court, wanted to shape American jurisprudence, wanted to do work that mattered in ways that matched his gifts. The dream seemed impossible while he was president, seemed like fantasy that could not be realized, but he held it, carried it through the difficult years, used it as comfort during worst moments, reminded himself that presidency would end, that he could return to being judge. That his real life could resume after this interruption ended. The opportunity came in 1921. President Harding appointed Taft as Chief Justice. The appointment was gift, was answer to prayer, was the dream realized, was returned to himself after a decade of being someone else. Taft was 53, had served as president, had been humiliated politically, had lost election, had endured years of mockery and exhaustion, but now he could be what he had always wanted to be. Chief Justice, leader of Supreme Court, judge among judges, person doing work he loved in position he was perfectly suited for. The transformation was immediate, was visible, was remarked upon by everyone who saw him. He was happy, was genuinely happy in ways he had never been happy as president. The relief was palpable, was the visible evidence that he had come home, that he was finally in right place, that the long exile had ended. He served as Chief Justice for 9 years. From 1921 to 1930, these were his best years, his most productive years, his happiest years. He worked tirelessly, wrote important opinions, reformed court procedures, built the Supreme Court building, finally giving the court physical space separate from Capitol, made lasting contributions to American law, was respected and beloved by his colleagues, was effective as leader in ways he had never been effective as president, because this role fit him. This work matched his temperament, this position used his gifts. He could be himself completely, could think like judge because he was judge, could take time for deliberation because deliberation was valued, could be fair because fairness was expected, could write careful opinions because careful writing was the work. Everything that had been liability as president was asset as Chief Justice. Everything that had exhausted him now energized him. Everything that had been wrong was now right. He flourished. Thrived, was happy. The transformation from miserable president to happy Chief Justice was complete, was testimony to how important fit is, how much it matters to be in right role, how much difference it makes to work that matches your nature rather than contradicts it. The judge who was always a judge, who served briefly as president but was never really presidential, who found his true place on Supreme Court, who finally, after years of wandering, came home to law, to careful thought, to written opinions, to the work he loved, to being exactly who he was meant to be. The interruption ended, the exile concluded, the return was complete. The judge, the jurist, the person finally in right place doing right work being right self, forever, until illness forced retirement, until his body could no longer do what his mind still wanted to do, until 9 years of happiness ended. But those 9 years mattered, were genuine, were proof that he had been right all along. That he was meant to be judge, that presidency had been tragic interruption of his true calling, that being in wrong place had made him seem wrong person, but being in right place revealed the truth. He was gifted jurist, was capable leader in right context, was happy when allowed to be himself, the judge who was always a judge, finally home, finally happy, finally right, forever. To exist in body that does not conform is to exist under constant judgment, to be always aware that others are observing, are commenting, are making assumptions based on appearance rather than character, are reducing you to single physical characteristic, are seeing body before person, are allowing size to overshadow everything else. William Howard Taft lived this reality every day of his adult life. His weight was never private, was always public fact, was always remarked upon, was always subject of commentary that ranged from supposedly helpful advice to outright cruel mockery, was always the first thing people noticed, the characteristic that defined him in others' eyes regardless of what else he accomplished, regardless of his intelligence or kindness or legal brilliance. His body was public spectacle, was subject people felt entitled to discuss, to judge, to make jokes about. The violation was constant, was unrelenting, was part of every day. Every public appearance, every newspaper article, every cartoon, every comment, the cruelty was sometimes disguised as concern, sometimes presented as humor, but it was always cruelty, was always violence against his dignity, was always reduction of human being to physical dimension as if dimension were all that mattered, as if body size defined worth, as if weight were the story while person carrying weight was irrelevant. The cartoons were perhaps the cruelest. Were visual mockery that reduced him to caricature, that exaggerated his size to grotesque proportions, that showed him as balloon about to pop, as figure so large he could barely move, as object of ridicule rather than human deserving dignity. The cartoons appeared in newspapers across the nation, were seen by millions, were accepted as appropriate commentary on public figure, were not seen as cruelty but as humor, as legitimate political satire, as acceptable way to criticize president. But beneath the supposed humor was simple cruelty, was mockery of body that did not conform, was reduction of person to punchline, was visual violence that was repeated endlessly, that became permanent part of historical record, that ensured Taft would be remembered primarily for his size, that his weight would overshadow his accomplishments in visual memory as it overshadowed them in public discourse. It is said that newspaper articles discussed his diet with detail that would be unthinkable for any other subject, reported what he ate, how much he ate, whether he was attempting to diet, whether attempts were successful, whether weight had been lost or gained, treated his body as public property requiring public monitoring, as if readers had right to know intimate details of his physical management, as if his size gave them ownership over his choices. The articles were supposedly informational, were supposedly serving public interest by reporting on president's health, but beneath the supposed information was prurience, was fascination with body that did not conform, was the pleasure of judgment, of feeling superior, of having acceptable target for mockery disguised as concern. The endless articles about his weight were not concern, were cruelty, were constant reminder that he was being watched, judged, found wanting, were erosion of privacy, were violation of dignity, were ongoing assault disguised as journalism. The helpful suggestions were particularly painful form of violation, were people who felt entitled to tell him how to manage his body, how to lose weight, how to eat differently, how to exercise more, how to fix what they perceived as problem requiring fixing, as if he were unaware of his size, as if he had not tried, as if solution were simply following advice that strangers felt entitled to give. The suggestions were cruelty disguised as helpfulness, were judgment disguised as caring, were violation disguised as concern. They assumed his size was simply matter of not knowing what to do, of not trying hard enough, of lacking willpower. They ignored reality that weight is complex, is affected by genetics and metabolism and stress and psychological factors, that dieting often fails, that weight loss is rarely permanent, that his size might not be fully within his control regardless of effort. The suggestions were not help, were judgment, were additional burden, were one more way he was made to feel inadequate, was made to feel that his body was wrong, that he was failing, that solution existed if only he would try harder. The suggestions added to exhaustion, added to shame, added to the burden of carrying body that public felt entitled to comment on, to fix, to judge. Whispers tell us that Taft did try, did attempt weight loss multiple times, did follow various diets that his era offered, did restrict eating, did try different regimens, sometimes succeeded temporarily, would lose significant weight, would feel briefly that perhaps he could conform, could meet expectations, could make his body acceptable, but the weight always returned, would creep back slowly, would exceed previous weight sometimes, would restore him to size that brought mockery, that brought more suggestions, that brought more judgment. The cycle created its own suffering, created its own shame, created sense of failure that was compounded with each attempt and each return to heavier weight. The dieting attempts were public knowledge, were reported in newspapers, were discussed as if his body were appropriate subject for national conversation. The public nature of his private struggle made everything worse, made failure not just personal but public spectacle, made weight regain not just disappointment but humiliation. Made his body not just his own burden but public entertainment. The mockery took many forms, sometimes direct insults, sometimes jokes that used his weight as punchline, sometimes cartoons that exaggerated his size, sometimes stories like the bathtub myth that were designed to humiliate, sometimes simply the constant attention to his appearance rather than his accomplishments. The varied forms all served same function, all reduced him, all made his body the story. All treated him as object of ridicule rather than subject of dignity. The mockery was socially acceptable, was not seen as cruelty, was justified as legitimate commentary on public figure, was defended as humor that should not be taken seriously. But the mockery wounded, accumulated, created burden that was carried daily, that added to exhaustion, that made his body not just physical weight but psychological and social burden as well. The enduring obsession with his size is testament to cruelty's persistence. Over a century after his death, Taft is still primarily remembered for his weight. Historical accounts still emphasize his size before mentioning his accomplishments. Children still learn about him as the fat president. The bathtub myths still circulate as if they were facts. His body is still the story while his jurisprudence is footnote. His Supreme Court service, where he was genuinely effective and happy, is barely known. His progressive policies as president are forgotten. His legal mind is unacknowledged, but everyone knows he was fat. Everyone remembers his size. The body became the story, overshadowed everything else, became his defining characteristic not because it was most important thing about him, but because we made it most important, because we chose to focus on his body rather than his mind, because we found his size more interesting than his character. Because reducing people to their physical characteristics is easier than engaging with their complexity. The cruelty persists because we preserve it, because we repeat the jokes, because we teach children that the interesting thing about Taft is his weight, because we choose mockery over understanding, body over accomplishment, cruelty over compassion. The body that public mocked is gone now. Taft died in 1930. His body returned to earth, became dust, became part of the cycle that all flesh completes. But the mockery persists, lives in historical memory, lives in the stories we tell, lives in how we remember him, lives in the reduction that we preserve. The cruelty outlived the person it targeted, outlived the suffering it created, continues serving the functions it served, then making us feel superior, giving us acceptable target for judgment, allowing us to reduce human to dimension. The body that public mocked is testimony not to Taft's reality but to our cruelty. To what we choose to remember, to how we treat those who do not conform, to the violence we commit while calling it humor, to the ongoing choice to make appearance the story while forgetting the person. The body, the mockery, the cruelty, all preserved, all continuing, all testimony to how we fail to see humans fully, how we reduce, how we mock, how we make bodies that do not conform into stories while forgetting the people who lived in those bodies, who suffered in those bodies, who deserved better than the mockery we preserve as their memorial. The body that public mocked, forever remembered for wrong reasons, forever reduced to size, forever testimony to our cruelty, forever. Continue with chapters 910. I can complete the final 2 chapters to bring the script to conclusion. After the presidency, after the defeat that brought relief rather than grief, after the years of being wrong person in wrong place, after Roosevelt's betrayal and public mockery and the exhaustion of performing role he never wanted, after the endless afternoons of desperate sleep that was escape from unbearable burden, after all of this, after the long exile from himself, Taft found his place, found his calling. Found the position where he could finally be fully himself without apology or performance or the constant effort of being someone he was not. Chief Justice of the United States, appointed in 1921 by President Harding, serving until illness-forced retirement in 1930. 9 years, not long in the span of a life, but these were his years, his true years, the time when everything aligned, when who he was matched what he did, when his gifts were used rather than suppressed. When his temperament was asset rather than liability, when afternoon naps were no longer escape from misery but natural rhythm in satisfying life, when sleep became peace rather than survival strategy. The transformation was immediate, was visible to everyone who knew him. The day the appointment was announced, Taft wept with joy and relief and the overwhelming emotion of receiving what you have wanted for so long, what you have dreamed of through years of darkness, what you thought might never come. The tears were genuine, were the body's release of years of tension, years of holding himself together through work he hated, years of suppressing his nature, years of being wrong person in wrong place, all of it releasing in that moment of finally being chosen for the right role, for the work he loved, for the position he was suited for. The appointment was not just job, was restoration, was return to himself after decade of exile, was permission to be who he had always been, who he had never stopped being even when forced to pretend otherwise. It is said that his first day as Chief Justice felt like homecoming, felt like returning to place where he belonged after long absence. The Supreme Court building did not yet exist that would be Taft's project, his legacy, his gift to the court, but the chambers were there. The quiet spaces where briefs were read and arguments considered and opinions written. The environment where thought was valued, where careful deliberation was expected, where being thorough was virtue, where everything about his temperament fit perfectly. He entered these spaces not as exile but as someone coming home, not as stranger but as person who had always belonged here, had been meant for this, had simply been delayed by detour through wrong career, but now the detour was over. Now he was where he should have been all along. The relief was profound, was transformative, was visible in his face, his posture, his entire demeanor. He was happy, genuinely happy, happy in ways he had never been happy as president, happy in ways that seemed almost foreign after so many years of misery. The work was everything he had hoped, was exactly what his mind needed, what his spirit required. The reading of briefs engaged him completely. The legal questions were complex, fascinating, requiring the careful thought he excelled at. Conferences with fellow justices were collegial, were intellectual exchanges among equals, were the kind of discussion that satisfied his need for thoroughness, for considering all perspectives, for reasoning carefully toward conclusions. The writing of opinions allowed him to do what he did best: to explain legal reasoning clearly, to analyze precedents, to construct arguments that would guide future cases, to shape American jurisprudence in ways that would last beyond his tenure, beyond his life. To make contributions that mattered, that used his gifts, that made him feel his work had meaning, had value, had purpose that matched his abilities. Whispers tell us that his colleagues loved him, that he was successful as leader of the court in ways he had never been successful as leader of the nation. The difference was context, was being in right environment with right people doing right work. As president, his judicial temperament had been liability, had made him seem weak, indecisive, unable to provide political leadership that role required. But as Chief Justice, that same temperament was exactly what was needed, was what made him good leader. His fairness created trust among justices. His thoroughness ensured cases were carefully considered. His willingness to listen to all perspectives created environment where discussion was genuine, where minds could be changed through argument, where the work was about finding right answers rather than asserting power. He led not through dominance but through respect, through creating conditions where others could do their best work, through being person others trusted and valued. The leadership that had eluded him as president came naturally as Chief Justice because the role fit him, because he was finally right person in right place. He worked tirelessly, wrote hundreds of opinions, more opinions than any Chief Justice before him. The productivity was not burden, was joy. Was the work he loved done in an environment that supported him? He wrote clearly, explained reasoning carefully, made law accessible, made decisions understandable. His opinions were respected, were cited, were part of how American law developed, were his lasting contribution, were evidence that he was not inadequate human who failed at presidency, was gifted jurist who had been misplaced in wrong role, who flourished once returned to right role, who had always had the capacity for excellence but needed right context to manifest it. The Supreme Court provided that context, allowed him to be excellent, to contribute meaningfully, to do work that mattered in ways that matched his abilities. The building project was his vision, his initiative, his gift to the court and to the nation. For its entire history, the Supreme Court had met in space borrowed from the Capitol, had no building of its own, no physical home that matched its importance. Taft believed the court deserved its own building, deserved space designed for its work, deserved physical manifestation of its role in American government. He pushed for funding, planned the building, worked with architects, supervised the project, fought for what the court needed. The building would not be completed until after his death, would not open until 1935. but it was his vision made real, his legacy in stone, his gift that outlasted him. The magnificent building that still houses the Supreme Court, that still serves the work of justice, is Taft's creation, his testimony to his leadership, to his vision, to what he could accomplish when given right role, right context, right work. The afternoon naps continued. His body still required rest that others did not need. His weight still created strain that made daily functioning exhausting. His sleep apnea still interrupted nighttime rest. His health was declining, his heart struggling under the burden his body placed on it. But the naps were different now. Were not escape from unbearable burden. Were not desperate survival strategy. Were simply rest. Were natural pause in satisfying work. Were body's requirement being honored rather than being source of shame. The naps were part of his rhythm, part of how he managed his energy, part of his self-care in life that was finally, genuinely his own. The sleep came as it had always come, quickly, deeply. But the waking was different, was not return to misery, was return to work he loved, to colleagues he respected, to life that fit him. The transformation of the naps from survival to peace was testimony to how much context matters, how much fit matters, how the same bodily need can feel entirely different depending on whether you are in right place or wrong place. The naps as president had been escape. The naps as Chief Justice were rest. Same action, different meaning, different experience. Different relationship to the sleep that body required. He served until his body could not continue, until 1930, when his health had deteriorated too far, when his heart was failing, when simply sitting through arguments became too exhausting, when he had to admit that his body could no longer do what his mind still wanted to do. The resignation in February 1930 was grief, was loss. Was being forced to leave work he loved, work that had finally made him happy, work that had justified all the suffering that preceded it, work that had proven he was capable, was gifted, was exactly right person when given right role. The resignation was end of his true career, was leaving home after finally finding it, was loss of the one thing that had made sense, that had felt right, that had given him joy. He died 1 month later, March 8, 1930. Heart finally giving out after years of strain, after lifetime of carrying weight that heart was not designed to carry. But he died knowing he had been happy, had found his calling, had served where he was meant to serve, had contributed meaningfully, had been in right place doing right work, being right self. The month between resignation and death was brief, but the 9 years before the Supreme Court years, those had been his real life, his true life. The life he should have had all along if presidency had not interrupted. The Supreme Court years where sleep became peace, where rest was rhythm rather than refuge, where afternoon naps were part of life that satisfied rather than escape from life that crushed, where Taft was finally, completely, blessedly himself, where everything aligned, where gifts were used, where happiness was real, where he proved that the problem had never been him, had been the role, had been the mismatch. Had been wrong person in wrong place, but right person in right place. That person flourished, that person contributed, that person was happy. The Supreme Court years, the transformation, the fulfillment, the peace, all real, all genuine, all testimony that he had been right all along, that he was meant to be judge. That presidency had been tragic interruption, but that interruption had ended, that he had come home, that he had found his place, that he had been happy, finally, genuinely, completely. The Supreme Court years, his real life, his true self, his happiness, forever preserved in memory of those 9 years when everything was finally right. What remains now is not the caricature, not the fat president stuck in bathtub that never actually held him, not the jokes or the mockery or the myths that reduce complex human to single punchline, not the cruelty that history chose to preserve while forgetting the truth. What remains, what should remain, what deserves to remain if we are honest, if we are kind, if we are willing to see past our own need to judge, is something more genuine, more complete, more human, more true. William Howard Taft was man who slept because sleep was necessary, because his body required rest that others' bodies did not require, because his burdens were real even if they differed from burdens others carried, because his exhaustion was genuine even if others could not see it, because rest is not weakness but wisdom, because afternoon naps were adaptation that allowed functioning rather than indulgence that indicated failing. Because knowing your limits and working within them is strength rather than surrender. Because being honest about what your body needs is courage rather than confession of inadequacy. This final chapter is not summary, is not recitation of what has already been said, is instead space, is silence that holds rather than empties, is invitation to sit with what Taft's story reveals, about how we judge bodies that do not conform, about how we treat those placed in wrong roles, about how we preserve cruelty while forgetting complexity, about how we reduce humans to dimensions that make us comfortable while ignoring dimensions that would require us to see them fully, about all the ways that Taft's experience speaks to experiences that are not his alone, that are shared by many, that illuminate something about human vulnerability and social cruelty and the cost of being different, that teach if we are willing to learn, that challenge if we are willing to be challenged, that invite compassion if we are willing to feel compassion. It is said that every story contains choice, that history is not fixed truth but collective decision about what to remember and how to remember it. We have chosen collectively to remember Taft primarily for his weight, for his afternoon naps presented as laziness, for bathtub that became legend, for physical characteristics that made him subject of mockery. We have chosen to preserve cruelty while forgetting kindness, to emphasize body while ignoring mind, to make his size the story while his accomplishments become footnotes. These choices are not inevitable, are not required by facts, are decisions we make and continue making each time we repeat the jokes, each time we teach children that the interesting thing about Taft is that he was fat, each time we choose punchline over person, mockery over understanding, simplification over complexity. The choices are ours, the responsibility is ours. And the possibility of choosing differently remains available. What if we chose to remember differently? What if we led with his judicial brilliance, his Supreme Court building, his progressive trust-busting, his gentle character that persisted despite cruelty, his wisdom about knowing his limits, his courage in accepting rest his body required despite social judgment, his 9 happy years as Chief Justice that proved he was gifted leader in right context, his lasting contributions to American jurisprudence, his fundamental decency that politics could not corrupt. What if these were the stories we told? What if his weight was mentioned as biographical detail rather than defining characteristic? What if the bathtub myth was debunked rather than repeated? What if we honored his truth rather than preserving mockery? The choice is available. The different remembering is possible. The question is whether we are willing, whether we value truth over entertainment, compassion over cruelty, complexity over simplification, the full human over the reduced caricature. Whispers tell us that Taft would have wanted to be remembered as jurist, as Chief Justice who loved the court and served it well, as person who found his calling after detour, as someone who was happy when given right work. The afternoon naps, he would have wanted those understood as adaptation rather than failing, as wisdom about self-care, as recognition of his body's needs and willingness to honor those needs despite judgment. The weight, he would have wanted it acknowledged as reality he lived with rather than moral failing he deserved to be punished for. The presidency, he would have wanted it understood as role he accepted to please others rather than ambition he pursued for himself, as 4 years of suffering followed by 9 years of happiness, as proof that fit matters more than capability, that being in wrong place makes even capable persons seem inadequate, but that being in right place allows flourishing. The remembering he would have wanted is available to us, is choice we can make, is honor we can give to man who suffered enough during life without our cruelty following him beyond death. The silence that holds the rest is not empty, is full of everything we have explored together, full of understanding about his body and its burdens, about presidency he never wanted and Supreme Court position he cherished, about friendship that became betrayal and happiness that came late but came genuinely, about afternoon naps that were survival and then were peace, about all the complexity that crude jokes erase, that bathtub myths obscure, that our collective cruelty has tried to make invisible. The silence holds this complexity, holds the full truth of his experience, holds the person beneath the caricature, holds the human beneath the historical figure, holds everything we miss when we reduce him to his weight, holds everything we lose when we choose mockery over understanding. Perhaps most importantly, the silence holds invitation, invites us to consider our own relationship to rest, to bodies that do not conform, to people placed in wrong roles, to the difference between being in right place and wrong place, to all the ways that Taft's story is not unique but shared. How many people need more rest than is considered normal? How many struggle with bodies that society deems unacceptable? How many accept roles they know they are unsuited for because they cannot disappoint those they love? How many suffer in wrong places while being judged for the suffering? How many would flourish if given right contexts? Taft's story is particular, but the themes are universal. The invitation is to recognize ourselves in his experience, To see our own struggles with embodiment and role and the gap between who we are and what we are expected to be, to extend to ourselves the compassion we might extend to him, to honor rest we need, to seek right roles rather than accepting wrong ones, to be honest about our limits rather than pretending limits do not exist. The silence holds this invitation, holds possibility of learning from his example, of being changed by his story, of choosing differently than he was able to choose, of finding our right places while we can still enjoy them. The image we close with is not Taft stuck in bathtub, is not Taft being mocked, is Taft at peace, in the one place he truly belonged, in Supreme Court chambers, reading briefs, writing opinions, leading justices, building the building that would house the court forever, being himself completely, using his gifts fully, happy, genuinely happy. This is the image that deserves to last. This is the truth that should be preserved. This is the memorial he deserves, not the cruel jokes, not the bathtub myths, not the reductive focus on weight, but the memory of man who found his calling after long detour, who served with distinction when given right role, who was happy when placed correctly, who proved that fit matters more than we often acknowledge, who teaches us still if we are willing to learn about the importance of being in right place, about the wisdom of knowing ourselves, about the courage of honoring our needs despite judgment, about the possibility of flourishing when everything finally aligns. The afternoon light streams through windows, in our imagination, in our honoring, in our better remembering. Taft sits in his chambers, his work before him, his colleagues nearby, his happiness genuine. His eyes grow heavy as afternoon wanes. He allows himself the rest his body requires. He lies down without shame, without apology, without the burden of judgment. He closes his eyes, he sleeps. And in sleeping demonstrates wisdom that his era did not recognize, but that ours might finally be ready to acknowledge. That rest is necessary, that bodies have needs that must be honored, that knowing your limits is strength, that taking care of yourself is not selfish but essential, that sleep is not weakness but requirement, that afternoon naps are not failing but wisdom. He sleeps peacefully, in right place, doing right work, being right self, finally, completely. The sleep is not escape now. Is simply rest, is the body's natural rhythm being honored, is consciousness taking the break it needs to continue functioning. Is William Howard Taft being wise about his own needs, being honest about his limits, being kind to himself, being at peace? The silence holds this peace, holds this rest, holds this truth that is so much richer than the myths we have preserved, holds the invitation to remember differently, to choose compassion over cruelty, to honor complexity over simplification. To see Taft fully rather than partially, to recognize his gifts instead of only acknowledging his weight, to learn from his example about fit and calling and the courage to rest, to allow him the dignity that life often denied him, to give him in death the understanding that he deserved in life. The silence holds all of this, holds the possibility of better memory, better understanding, better honoring of person who suffered enough without our cruelty adding to that suffering beyond his death. The silence is gift, is space we create for truth, for compassion, for seeing clearly, for remembering well, for choosing kindly, for honoring fully. The silence holds the rest, both the rest he needed and found and the rest of his story, the parts we have forgot, the truths we have obscured, the complexity we have erased, the humanity we have denied, all held in silence that waits for us, that invites us, that offers us chance to choose differently, to remember better, to honor truly. Rest now. As Taft rested, as we all need to rest, as bodies require and wisdom honors, rest knowing that needing rest is not failing, rest understanding that sleep is necessity not luxury, rest accepting that your body's needs are legitimate, rest with the knowledge that afternoon naps are wisdom, rest in the afternoon light that streams golden through windows, rest in the silence that holds you, rest in the peace that comes from being honest about what you need. Rest as Taft finally learned to rest not as escape but as rhythm, not as survival but as peace, not as failing but as wisdom. Rest, sleep, be at peace. The day has been long, the burdens have been real, the exhaustion is genuine, and rest, simple, necessary, life-sustaining rest is not just permitted but required, not just acceptable but essential, not just allowed but honored. Rest. The silence holds you, the afternoon deepens, the light grows golden. And somewhere in that golden light, in that deep silence, in that sacred space between waking and sleeping, William Howard Taft rests too, no longer judged, no longer mocked, no longer reduced to his body while his character is forgot, but honored, remembered truly, seen fully, as he deserved to be seen, as he deserves to be remembered. The judge, the gentle person, the man who found peace after suffering, the human who needed rest and finally found it. Rest now with him in the silence. In the peace, in the afternoon that knows no judgment, only rest, only peace, only the gentle surrender to sleep that bodies require and wisdom honors. Rest, sleep, peace, forever. Tonight we have rested with Taft, have understood his exhaustion, have honored his wisdom about rest, have challenged the cruel myths that history preserved, have seen the complex human beneath the caricature, have recognized that he was not failing president but wrong person in wrong place. Celebrated his Supreme Court years where he finally flourished, have understood that fit matters, that rest is necessary, that bodies have needs that must be honored, that afternoon naps are wisdom, that being in right place transforms everything. May his example teach us. May his story invite us to remember differently, to be kinder to those whose bodies do not conform, to honor rest as necessary rather than judge it as weakness, to seek our own right places, to be honest about our needs. To rest when rest is required, sleep now if sleep comes. Rest as Taft finally learned to rest with peace rather than desperation, with acceptance rather than shame, with wisdom rather than apology. May your afternoon be golden, may your rest be deep, may you wake restored, as Taft deserved but rarely experienced, as we all deserve, as rest is meant to be. Sleep, rest, peace. The silence holds you, the afternoon welcomes you, the story is complete. Rest now, completely, peacefully, deeply. The vigil ends, the performance stops, the rest begins. Sleep, finally, gently, forever in the silence that honors, that holds, that remembers truly. Sleep, rest, peace.